All right, I want to welcome everyone, extension agents, everyone to our training this morning. This is our specialty crop training, the second of a series of 4 that we have planned that we're doing for agents over the next few weeks. We had our first one a couple of weeks ago on the 9th on hops production. Today it's on vegetable production, covering tomatoes, asparagus, pumpkins, sweet corn, and some of the economics with that. And as things go, and talking to Annette, we may have to do a little bit of adjustment on some of those. We do have a lot of things in the time slot today. December the 10th on a Friday at the same time at 9 Central, we'll be doing berries with Dr. Lockwood and Les Humple. And then in the new year on January the 13th, which is a Thursday at 9 a.m., tree nuts with Dr. Lockwood as well. So those are all in super. Agents, if you haven't signed up and want to, they're available for you. Please do that. A couple on the call this morning may not have gotten registered into super, so I'll take care of that after our session today. We'll get underway in just a moment with our presentation. Dr. Annette Wszelaki will do some things on the production on each of these crops. Dr. Margarita Velandia. Margarita, I may say your last name wrong. I'm sorry. I realized this morning I usually say Margarita, so I'm sorry about that. She's got some economic things that we will be looking at. Also on the call this morning is Debbie Ball with the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, and this project is funded through a specialty crop block grant through TDA. And I'll ask Debbie in just a minute if she's got any comments she might want to make about anything regarding TDA or anything that she's been working on. We are recording these sessions. I'll let you know following where these will be located so that you can look at these, whether they be on our CPA website or our specialty crop section, which makes the most sense, probably where that might be. And then later today to the agents, I'll send you just a brief survey about today's session. It's pretty brief. It shouldn't take you but a couple of minutes to do that. If you don't mind to do that for us, that would be helpful. We'll begin on a presentation in just a moment. I think Annette's going to lead off, and maybe as far as long as she wants to go and might need a breath, can hand it off to Margarita, let them figure out which way they want to go. But we do have a lot of things to cover this morning. If you have questions, maybe hold those, or if you want to put those in the chat, that will be fine as well. Before we start with other things, Debbie, if you want to come in and make a few comments about anything with TDA, and we just appreciate you being on the call and the work you've done with specialty crop block grants over the years and other things that TDA has going on.
Good morning, everybody. I hope my voice is coming through. I'm excited I was able to participate in this morning's workshop, and I'm not going to talk long because I know you guys have got a lot of stuff to cover. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on the attendee list. Hello. The Specialty Crop Block Grant Program for 2022, I'll announce it after the first of, probably in February, I will announce it, but I anticipate that it's going to be the same schedule that we normally have, with applications being due to me mid-March. It is a competitive process. I don't make the decision, a review committee does. But I do encourage everybody to share information about the program with any producers that you're working with that might be eligible to do some sort of research or educational project, because the projects have to benefit the industry. And that's basically it. Hope to see everybody in February at the PIC-TN conference. And thank you for letting me join you.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that. And again, the shout out to the conference coming up in middle of February. And Megan and Debbie's been on the road some this month doing some PIC Tennessee things across some of the counties. Some of you may have been involved with that. So I think they've had a good month doing those meetings also. Thanks, Debbie, for being here this morning. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I enjoyed the last couple of weeks with Megan, but we did cover the state.
It looked like you did. It looked like you did. Great.
Okay.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
All right. With that, Annette, we'll let you get us going here this morning. Thank you and Margarita for agreeing to do this and being part of our session this morning.
Thanks for having us. I'm going to go ahead and get started because, as Troy said, I have way too much to cover. And so, Margarita, if I'm going too long, just cut me off. I know you're not shy. So I'm going to go through this pretty fast. and I'm terrible on Zoom about keeping up with the chat while I'm talking. So if you have a question or I'm going too fast or you want to stop and talk about something more, just unmute and yell and we'll take care of it. As Troy mentioned, we're covering 4 crops today, and that's a lot. So we're kind of just hitting the tip of the iceberg. And in a lot of these things, they might be concepts that are new to producers or that they're thinking about. And so I wanted to touch on some of those things. I didn't get into a lot of the pest and disease management because we just don't have time to do that. We did some of that in our diagnostic webinar series that we just finished up in October. And if you weren't able to attend those, just shoot me an email if you want to see the material we covered there, and I'd be happy to share links for that. Same thing with varieties. I could spend probably the next 2 hours just talking about varieties, but I wanted to hit the highlights of the production topics. So asparagus is our first one. And this one's really a unique one amongst vegetable crops because it's a perennial, unlike most of our vegetables that are annuals. And so it can be productive, kind of like an orchard, for 15 years or more. So it's really critical that you get it right. That site selection and preparation are critical because if you don't, you're going to shorten the life of your asparagus plot and you're not going to get the yield that you could. So field prep should take place at least a year before planting. Some folks say 2 years before planting. So you can really make sure you get the pH in the right range and you get the fertilizer in the right range. But really what we're trying to do in those first 3 years, just like in an orchard situation, we're building the storage roots and we're really getting that plot established for long-term harvest. So site selection for asparagus, it's going to grow best in deep, well-drained sandy loam soil. We don't have a lot of sandy loam in Tennessee, but it can tolerate heavy soils as long as you have that good drainage. And you want to make sure you're not putting asparagus back in a field that previously had asparagus because it's self-allelopathic. We often hear about allelopathy between crops, but self-allelopathy is just as you would think. The older asparagus will have a negative effect on those young asparagus plants that you're putting in or the crowns you're putting in. So you want to make sure if you're going from one asparagus field or planting to another, it's in a different plot of soil. Just like with everything, we want to test our soil to determine any liming and fertilizer requirements. Oh, is there a question? I thought I heard somebody. All right. So the ideal pH for asparagus is going to be between 6.7 and 7. So it's a little higher than some other crops, but it's not going to do well in acidic soil or pH below 6. And Fusarium crown and root rot can survive better at that lower pH. So we want to make sure that our pH is up, and liming it, it'll slowly come down into that 6.7 to 7 range. So you can shoot a little higher at first when you're liming it. Of course, that lime's going to take time to be active. So you want to account for that in that first year. And also Fusarium is really something you don't want to get in your asparagus planting. It can survive in the field for up to 7 years. So once it's there, you're stuck with it and there's not a lot you're going to be able to do. So getting that pH in the right range can really help with that. So soil preparation, and this is kind of bouncing around. I was trying to figure out the best order for some of these, but we'll bounce around a little bit. This was from a workshop we did back in 2008, an asparagus workshop that we did here in Knox County. So we have the producer plowing in his furrow there that he's going to plant the asparagus into. We want to make sure that we plow down the soil amendments before we start constructing our furrows. So we get a nice uniform spread of those soil amendments. And then asparagus is going to be planted into these furrows, and they're going to be 6 to 8 inches deep, and they're going to be below the soil surface. So often different than what we think about when we're trying to raise beds for vegetable production. With asparagus, we're really making a furrow to put them down into. So for establishment of the planting, of course, we want to follow our soil test recommendations. But in addition to that, we want to apply 400 pounds per acre of phosphorus, just phosphorus, straight in that furrow at planting. And phosphorus is really important for developing that planting, for crown development. And it cannot effectively be added once the furrow is closed in, because phosphorus is one of those nutrients that's not going to move. So we want to make sure it's in there. If it's not in that furrow when you're planting, it's going to decrease your yields and the overall life of your planting. So that's an important step. Then for maintenance fertility for your planting, you still want to do soil tests for the first 4 years annually to make sure that that fertility and pH is where you want it, and continue to tweak and make adjustments as you can. And you want to apply about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre every year. And that's going to be broadcast before cutting season, half of it, 50 pounds per acre. And then you're going to side dress after cutting, 50 pounds per acre. As we said, the phosphate is really not going to move too much, but we still want to make sure it's going to have enough throughout the life of that planting. So we're going to broadcast it before cutting season according to our soil recommendations. Same for potash. And we have the low, medium, and high recommendations here. This is also from the table in the Southeast Vegetable Crop Handbook, which is a handy reference for folks, and I'll reference it a few times while we're talking about this. So planting, we want to make sure that the soil temperature is at least 50 degrees, and that's going to be critical so we get rapid crown growth. So we want to keep an eye on that. We don't want to plant into those cold soils, because prolonged exposure to both cold and wet soils is going to increase that susceptibility to fusarium that we're trying to avoid. So oftentimes folks are buying in their crowns. If they get them before their field is ready, before those temperatures are up, they want to make sure that they're storing them between 33 and 38 degrees, and that's going to help prevent bud sprouting. So if the buds sprout, you're going to not have a high quality crown, and it's going to compromise your whole planting. So that's really crucial that you harvest or you handle those crowns appropriately once you get them. Some folks like to do their own production from seed of their asparagus. It can be started in a greenhouse 8 to 10 weeks before transplanting, or more commonly, people just buy their crowns in bulk. So they're either planted as 1 or 2-year-old crowns, and the crown is a developed root system. So it's going to have a fairly defined storage organ and growth buds already on it. And when you get those crowns, they're going to probably be in bundles of about 25 crowns together. You want to go through and sort them for size, and then you want to plant similarly sized crowns in the same row. And the reason you want to do that instead of just randomly planting the crowns that are in the bundle is because the larger crowns can tend to outgrow the smaller crowns and compromise those smaller crowns near them. So if you're planting all similarly sized crowns in the same row, you don't have that issue. All in all, you're going to have about 12 to 14,000 plants per acre, and asparagus is planted in single rows, and generally with about a foot between plants in the row and 5 to 6 feet between rows. And those asparagus ferns are going to get pretty large, and so that room between the rows is going to help. As I said, we don't have a lot of time to delve into varieties. So for all of these crops, I referenced the page in the south, or pages in some cases, of the Southeastern U.S. Vegetable Crop Handbook that has the variety recommendations. So if you haven't looked at these before, for every crop in the Southeastern Vegetable Crop Handbook, we have variety recommendations there on the left-hand side, and then we have them by state. Since we're close to many of these other states, our neighboring states, even if it's not recommended for Tennessee necessarily, it's probably okay for someone to try a variety that's not a Tennessee recommended variety. I haven't done any asparagus trialing here, so this is based all off of knowledge mainly from other states. North Carolina is one that's done a lot of work in asparagus. They had a former agent that this was really his passion. You'll notice on these varieties that the superscript 2 indicates the male hybrids. And I always like to say with asparagus, this is the one situation where the men outperform the women, because the female hybrids produce seeds, which decreases the overall yield. The male hybrids don't. So that's an important thing to look for. Almost all of these are male hybrids, except for these UC varieties at the bottom. The Jersey series up here, those were all bred at Rutgers, and those are very popular varieties and the bulk of what we see folks grow. There is one purple variety in here, Purple Passion, and that one is also popular with a lot of folks just to get some variety in what is planted. Another fun thing with asparagus, if you exclude the light while the spears are growing, you'll get blanched or white spears. So that's another nice thing for marketing. And I think we're seeing more and more asparagus at farmers markets and direct markets because it is a great crop to grow, that you have it there. It's fairly low maintenance once you get it established, and it's something that people look forward to, and they often can't get enough of it when it has that short window of a season. So doing some white asparagus would be another great thing for a market. So because we're spending those first years really getting the roots established and getting a strong food storage base in our planting, we really want to curtail the length of time for harvesting our asparagus, and it's going to gradually increase every year for those first 5 years, and then we're going to be at our maximum harvest window. So in year 1, some folks recommend you don't harvest at all. Others recommend that you harvest it for a short window of about 7 days. In year 2, you double that, so you harvest for 2 weeks or 14 days. Year 3, you up it another week, so you're harvesting for 21 days. And then in year 4, you're harvesting about 30 to 36 days. And finally, by year 5, you're at your maximum harvest length, which is generally about 6 to 7 weeks. So for some harvesting tips, we want to make sure, like with all crops, as much as we can, we want to harvest in the morning. And that's so we're not building up the field heat. And it's really critical for something like asparagus, because asparagus is a true vegetable, and the tips of the asparagus are actually the flower buds. So it's just like a cut flower would behave. It has a really high respiration rate. We don't want to get that heat in there because that's going to cause it to use up more of its reserves once it's taken off the plant, and we're not going to have as long as a shelf life as if we can keep the heat out of it and keep it cool from the time we harvest it until we get it sold to our consumer or our market. So generally we want to harvest the spears when they're 7 to 9 inches in length, and we want to make sure that they have a good diameter on them. And you can see a variety of diameters in the grocery store. So there's some small, like pencil diameter asparagus, but then there's thicker asparagus too. So honestly, I think there's a market for both, but generally we want a diameter of 5/16 of an inch or more. And then especially early on, we want to stop harvesting when about 3/4 of those spears are pencil diameter. We don't want to harvest it to death. And unlike a lot of crops, with asparagus, it's better to snap it off with your fingers just above the soil line instead of cutting it. And that's because when you cut asparagus, it gets this hard, fibrous thickening right at the butt of the asparagus spear. So to avoid that, you snap it off right at the soil line with your thumb and forefinger, and it makes the whole stalk usable, or the whole spear usable. Generally early in the season, it can be harvested every other day, but in the height of the season, once the temperatures are above 70 degrees constantly, you want to harvest it daily. And that's because those spears can grow a lot, kind of like an okra pod, but these asparagus spears can grow about 2 inches in a day. So if you don't harvest it daily, you could miss it and it could get long and leggy on you. As I mentioned, asparagus is really highly respiring, so it has a short shelf life unless we keep it nice and cool to reduce that respiration rate. So we want to make sure when we get it out of the field, we cool it immediately or get it to the market immediately. And if folks have cooling capabilities on their farm, they want to cool it between 32 and 36 degrees. High humidity is also really important, as that stem is a really large wound. And if we're snapping it off, that's also causing a large wound. More than if we cut it with a sharp knife, but if we cut it with the knife, then we have that fibrousness or hardening going on. So it's kind of a trade-off. So we also want to keep the relative humidity high. And for folks that might have stored asparagus before, oftentimes we want it to be stored upright or away from light, because it can be both gravitropic and phototropic, that if you store it on its side, it can start, the tips can start angling upwards. So oftentimes you see it stored in the grocery store in a bunch upright. And the same thing should be true for the growers. There used to be a recommendation that you store it in water so it doesn't dehydrate. However, with newer food safety recommendations, that one's probably not a good idea, because if you do have contamination in one bunch and you're storing them all together, now you're going to have all of your asparagus contaminated in that water potentially. Ideally, under these low temperature and high relative humidity conditions, asparagus is going to have a storage life of 1 to 2 weeks. But the faster you can get it off the farm and to your consumer, the better off you'll be, because you don't want to be holding it for a week and then your consumer only has a short shelf life on it when they get it home. So planting maintenance is always a question with asparagus, when to chop those ferns off. So during the second year, about 3 weeks before the spears are going to emerge, you want to mow off the dead ferns. And then if the grower is inclined to use herbicides, you want to tank mix approved pre and post harvest emergence herbicides in there. And again, you can reference the Southeast Vegetable Handbook for the list that's approved for asparagus. You want to mow those ferns as close to the ground as possible, but you definitely don't want to mow them in the fall, because the dead ferns help keep moisture in and they keep the soil cooler, which helps prevent early emergence in the spring. And if you have early emergence, oftentimes asparagus can be damaged by frost. So you want to make sure that you're keeping them underground as long as possible so they don't get that frost damage. All right, that was a whirlwind tour of asparagus, and that was the easiest one to do because it had the least amount of slides. Are there any asparagus questions before we move on? All right, then we'll keep on trucking. The next one's pumpkin production, and those of you that know me well know that I could talk about pumpkin production for 2 hours all by itself. We've been really fortunate to have a nice collaboration with NC State ever since I came to UT. The pandemic last year kind of put a damper on our pumpkin collaboration, but we've done a pumpkin trial together every year since 2007. So this is a fun crop, and more folks are getting into pumpkins, and there's so much diversity within pumpkins that it's really a great crop to grow for us. And we see more and more agritourism farms popping up, and it's just a fun crop that folks start decorating earlier and earlier, and they keep those pumpkin fall decorations going right through Thanksgiving, although I've seen a lot of Christmas decorations already up. So pumpkins are going to do well on most soils, but again, with everything, we want well-drained soils. Nothing likes to have wet feet, so we want to make sure that that soil is well drained, and you want to make sure that you're rotating your pumpkins as much as possible, and that can include cover crop rotations. It doesn't have to be necessarily cash crop rotations. But you don't want to plant pumpkins in the field where other vine crops have been, especially during the last 2 years, because they're going to get the same diseases and pests and weeds. And so you really want to change it up and help yourself on the pest management side there. So we do see a lot of pumpkins grown on bare ground, and the fertility requirements are going to be different on bare ground versus plasticulture, which we'll talk about, I think, with all the next 3 crops that we're talking about today. So bare ground fertility is going to be lower in this case. We only need 80 to 90 pounds of total nitrogen per acre, and we're going to split that up. About half of it we're going to put down pre-plant, and then half we're going to side dress with. So if you are using cover crops in your rotation, you want to take that into account when you're applying your nitrogen. If you're applying legume, if you're growing legume cover crops, that's going to give you some of that nitrogen. If you're sorry, my words are mingling here today, mixing up here. If you're using a grain cover crop, you might need to up your nitrogen a little bit, because it might hold more of that nitrogen in the soil and it won't be available to the pumpkins. So just keep in mind the cover crop that's used in a rotation if you're using one. Oftentimes folks think more is better, and you all know that more nitrogen doesn't equal more yield. If we get too much, we're just going to have a lot of vine and less fruit, and we'll also have greener fruit, and it's going to have a shorter shelf life. So getting the nitrogen and the fertility right can really benefit those pumpkins. More and more we see pumpkins on plasticulture because we see folks double cropping. Oftentimes they'll do strawberries, and then when the strawberries come off, it's a perfect time to put pumpkins back in. So they'll take advantage and double crop those two together. There are also two crops that lend themselves well to either you-pick operations or having the workers pick them and direct marketing them right there from the farm. So plasticulture, of course, is going to be an extra cost up front, but if done well, we can see increased yield and quality, because oftentimes the pumpkins will stay on the plastic. Oftentimes they'll vine out too, but that'll help us get cleaner fruit, and it'll help us increase the yield because of that warmness in the bed. With pumpkin, more than other crops, we don't see as much of that warmness enhancement because we're planting them in June when it's already fairly warm here in Tennessee, or very warm in Tennessee. But plasticulture, another big benefit is it can potentially save on weed management. And it's nice because during that, what we call the critical period, that first 4 to 6 weeks, the plastic will take care of the weeds, and then the crops vine out, and it pretty much takes care of many of its own weeds. But you want to make sure anytime you're using plasticulture that you really take the time to prepare that seed bed well, because if you don't do it well, you're not going to get all those benefits that plasticulture can give you, and you've already invested extra costs in it. So for plastic mulch fertility, we're going to end up applying 80 to 150 pounds of total nitrogen per acre, and we're going to apply about 25 to 50 pounds at planting, and then we're going to apply the remainder through fertigation for the rest of the growing season. So we're going to have 8 to 10 weekly applications. They're going to begin about 3 to 4 weeks after planting, and we're going to alternate between calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate, and a water-soluble 20-20-20. And that's really going to help firm up your fruit. The calcium nitrate is going to help with that. Also, if you have the fertigation set up, oftentimes right at planting, folks won't run Admire through the drip tape, and Admire is going to give you about a month coverage for cucumber beetles and other bugs in there. So that can be very useful too. More and more we're seeing folks go into no-till pumpkins, and it's nice because as you all know, cover crops are going to help with that weed suppression, just like the plastic mulch will. They're going to help with water conservation, but they're also going to help with soil health and crop productivity, which the plastic mulch isn't really going to do much for your soil health, right? And those cover crops can also help retain nutrients in that root zone. Of course, the reason that we're using them mainly for pumpkins is because when we either chop them down or we crimp them down, they're going to give us a high residue mulch that's going to stay in place most of the season. It also is going to make sure that our pumpkins are resting on something other than bare soil. And this can also help to decrease your diseases as well, because you don't have that soil to pumpkin contact. For no-till pumpkin production, we often see cereal rye used. But again, keep in mind, if you're using a small grain cover crop, you might have to put down extra nitrogen. So 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen if that cover crop's going to be fairly mature when it's killed. And this photo here on the left is a fellow from Delaware that started out doing 1 acre of no-till pumpkins, and now he's up to over 500 acres of no-till pumpkins. So a great model for no-till pumpkin production. Ben Gilbert, who works with the Tennessee Farmers Co-op here, he is also a no-till pumpkin farmer and does a great job, and he'll be talking about pumpkin production at the Pick Tennessee conference. So I know we have a in-service in conjunction with the Pick Tennessee conference, and that would be a session. Oh, I think he's on Friday. Forget that. He's not on the Thursday session. I take it all back. Anyway, to do no-till with pumpkins, you can use the same planter that you use with row crop production, but folks need to make sure that their seed plates or feed cups are going to match the size of the pumpkin seed, because these are going to tend to be larger seeds. If you don't match it up, then you're going to damage your seed. Oh, I have the same thing on there twice. You can tell I was doing this late at night this week. So this system can also slow down your days to harvest depending on your soil type and the friability. But for someone who's used to a double cropping system where you have those strawberries and then you're planting pumpkin seed right back in, it can often make your germination faster than in that sort of system, because the soil under that plastic mulch is already compacted. So we had a good example of this out in West Tennessee with Denton Clay Parkins, who does a phenomenal job with his strawberries and his pumpkins. But he had a field that he wanted to do it no-till, and he was used to that plasticulture system where it's already compacted from being in strawberries and irrigated and sitting there over the whole winter while those strawberries are growing. And so he planted his no-till the same time he was planting his pumpkins on plasticulture, and the whole field was ready much earlier than that plasticulture field, and he ended up losing the field just because of that difference in timing. So it really depends on what system you're coming from. But if you're used to a fresh plasticulture system where that soil is not compacted, that's going to be your fastest, because we're warming those soils up. They're going to germinate because they have that good seed bed underneath. Then your no-till is going to be a little slower. So it really depends on what you're used to. So planting dates. Planting dates can be affected by a lot of things. First off, the relative maturity, and that generally goes along with the size of the pumpkin. So of course, minis are going to be ready before larger pumpkins would be ready. Next is your market. So if you're wholesaling and you have somebody that wants these early to mid-September, you're just going to count back from that date. The harvest date, the microclimate in your field. So we see this a lot. A lot of pumpkins are grown in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, where it's very hilly and a lot of microclimates going on there. So you want to be aware of that as well. Again, your production practices. So whether you're growing on bare ground, plasticulture, or no-tilling. And then of course your frost date. So you want to keep that in mind. That's generally not an issue for us. We're generally out of the field long before our first frost date, especially since folks want pumpkins earlier and earlier. And then your overall soil moisture. So most varieties are going to have a relative maturity of 90 to 115 days. And those aren't probably going to be exact dates for us, because those dates are generally set by the Northeast, where the companies have their seed trial locations. So generally we're going to be a little earlier than those dates down here, but again, it's going to depend on the season and what the weather and the temperature is. But you want to count back approximately when you want to have those in the ground, according to when you want to open up your farm stand on the farm, or when you have folks that are interested in having a truckload of pumpkins or whatever it may be, and then have them ready. So I learned from Ben this year that decorating porches is a big thing now, and there's some influencers that do these porch decorations, especially in Nashville and Asheville, and they want these in early September, and they don't want orange pumpkins, they want the dark green pumpkins. So not only are they decorating your porch early, but they generally have to decorate it twice, because those green pumpkins don't have the shelf life and they don't last. But apparently this is a good business to get into. These pumpkins are $700 and $900 to decorate your porch with these fancy displays. So interesting. Planting dates. So again, that's going to depend on your planting system. For bare ground, we generally are going to get them in a little earlier, early June to mid-June. For no-till, same sort of scenario. And then for plasticulture, we can generally wait till mid-June to late June. And that's going to have us harvesting mid to late September. And by then, everybody's chomping at the bit to get your pumpkins. So just like with the planting date, pumpkin spacing has a lot of factors that are going to affect it as well. And that's going to include plant vigor. So whether it's a bush or a semi-vine or a vine type, the fruit size that you want, again, the moisture, your equipment, and your weed control strategy. So if you need to get a tractor in between those rows, you're going to need a lot more space than if you're doing something else for weed control. So as a general rule, we try to give plants about 24 square feet of space. And this will give or take depending on the type of plant. So for bush plants, you don't need quite as much. If you have 5 to 6 feet between the rows and 2 to 3 feet in the row, that ought to give you enough space for those. For the semi-vines, we want about 6 to 8 feet between rows and then 2 to 4 feet in the row. And for the vining types, we want 8 to 10 feet and 4 to 5 feet in the row. And those vine types are really going to travel. In our variety trials, we always try to put unique things next to each other because we have to trace those vines back and get them right into the plot they grew in. And oftentimes, especially with the jack-o'-lanterns, it can be really hard to trace them back. And so those vine types go for 20, 30, 40 feet. They really are going to vine out. Irrigation. So we used to see a lot more pumpkin production that didn't have any irrigation to it. We still see that from time to time, but water is really critical to get good fruit development and fruit set. And, all these vegetables are 90+% water. So if we don't have the water to them, we're not going to get the crop that we could if we had water available. And moisture stress is going to affect our fruit size, but not the number. So if your pumpkins are moisture stressed, you're going to have the same number, but they're just going to be smaller. But generally, we want to shoot for 1 to 2.5 inches of water per acre per week, especially when they're forming those fruits. So we get nice big fruit. Pollination is another important consideration if you're growing a sizable amount of cucurbits. Of course, we know that bees are important for pollination and fruit set. For pollination, they can be adversely affected, as you know, by insecticides that are applied to the blooms or to nearby weeds. So you want to make sure that you're applying those insecticides in the evening hours or wait until the blooms are closed. And if folks are buying in bees, it's generally recommended that you have 1 hive per acre. Another thing about pollination in cucurbits is squash bees do a lot of the pollinating. They look very similar to honeybees, but they're not as hairy. So they're kind of like a smooth looking honeybee, and they'll do a lot of the pollination in our cucurbit crops. So another option, instead of bringing in hives, is just to have good flowering habitat to bring in pollinators for those cucurbits. So some of the harvest considerations with pumpkins. We want to harvest when they're fully mature and at least that they're turning dark orange. If they do have some orange on them, they will continue to turn all the way orange. But the more important thing is that the rind is hardened off. And you can test that on a few by just sticking your fingernail in. And if your fingernail can penetrate it, it's not ready. It's not hardened off yet. Like with any crop, we want to avoid harvesting when the foliage is wet, and that's just going to help reduce potential disease spread. In this case, we want to make sure that we're cutting, not twisting the stems off as close to the vine as possible. And that's something I'll often see in the stores around Halloween time. Somebody cut the stem right above the pumpkin, and the stem sells the pumpkin as much as the pumpkin itself. So we want those nice long stems, and you want to cut them as close to the vine as possible. Of course, you want to make sure that your pruners are sharp because that's going to have less of a wound than if they're a dull pruner. And you want to make sure that you're handling them carefully to prevent wounding and maintain that quality till you get them out the door. I want to point out that Melody Rose helped us one year. She used to work at the Waynesville station in North Carolina back in the day, so sometimes we get her to go up there for pumpkin harvests. Another thing about pumpkins is folks like to carry them by the stem, but not a good idea, especially for your workers. You see that all the time at pumpkin farms. People are carrying them out by the stem, but it's a good way to bust off the stem. Stems are another important indicator of quality. As I mentioned, people love unique stems on their pumpkins. More and more breeders are breeding for the stems, really big, long stems on smaller pumpkins. And the one here on the left has powdery mildew in that stem. First of all, it's not very attractive. It's not nice and green like this one on the right. But if that powdery mildew is already in the stem, it's going to go down into that pumpkin too, and run the risk that it's not going to make it to Halloween. So really important to keep up with the spray program. Powdery mildew is one of those diseases we know is going to blow in every year. So you want to have a good powdery mildew rotation, fungicide rotation. For post-harvest handling, pumpkin's actually a crop that is subject to chilling injury. So we don't want to store them too cool, and usually folks don't have enough room to store them too cool, but we want to store them in a cool, dry, dark place if possible. So a pole barn or some other building that might be out on the farm. Ideally, we want to store them between 50 and 60 degrees. Again, that might not be possible. We want the relative humidity to be right around what an ambient relative humidity is here in Tennessee, 50 to 70%. Again, ideally, we want to store them in a single layer. So if we do have some decay starting on one, it's not transferring to the one under it. Again, not always possible with space restrictions, but we do want to try to make sure that we have a barrier between pumpkins and the soil if possible. So either get them in cardboard bins, or if you have pallets at the farm that you can lay them out on, that's good too. Just so we have a barrier between the soil so they're not sitting on the soil and have the potential to decay before we get rid of them. So as I mentioned, there are a ton of fun varieties in what we call pumpkins, but they're actually winter squash for the most part. The standard jack-o'-lanterns are going to be the cucurbita pipos, and these many are bred for resistance. So for an IPM program, we always want folks to look for those varieties that already have some powdery mildew resistance. HM Close or Harris Moran really does a good job in getting powdery mildew resistance in the varieties that they breed. So they're a good place to look for this because cucurbita pipos don't naturally have that powdery mildew resistance in them, unlike the cucurbita maximas and the mochatas. So the maximas are going to be what we see as giant pumpkins or specialty types. So Gerardale down here at the bottom, or the blue-gray pumpkins, those are maximas. And you can tell them because their stem's a little different. You can see this nice attachment with it really going out into the pumpkin on these pipos. On the maximas, the stem actually curves back under right where it attaches to the plant. And these things are going to be really dense and really heavy. So you want to make sure, especially with this type, you're not hauling it by the stem, because they will break off fairly easily. But these are types that have natural resistance to powdery mildew. And if you look in a pumpkin trial field or a grower that's growing a lot of varieties, you'll see the difference with these vines, because they're going to stay nice and green. Where if powdery mildew kind of slacked off, a lot of growers kind of stop spraying for powdery mildew right around harvest time. So those vines will kind of die down. So you can get in there and harvest easy, but you can tell the difference in a field that has cucurbita maximas because they'll still be nice and green generally. The last type is the mochatas. So this is going to be the Long Island cheese. And these are native to the eastern US and Puerto Rico. So they are generally going to be more tolerant of hot, humid weather. This is also the same species of butternut squash. They also have better resistance to diseases and insects. So they're another one that's going to have that natural powdery mildew resistance to them, but just lots of fun varieties. So more and more we see folks, they come for a jack-o'-lantern to carve, but when they see what kind of diversity you have there on the farm, they're going to fill up their trunk because there's so many neat pumpkins to be had. With the maximas, we often see the stacks of pumpkins of all different colors, and there's just so many unique pumpkins out there. Keith Hart, a former extension agent, is another great example. He does a great job on his farm and just has an incredible amount of diversity. So again, I'm not going to delve into the varieties for the sake of time, but you can find the recommended, and there's a ton of them for Tennessee, since we've been doing these trials for so many years. You can find the recommendations in the Southeastern Vegetable Crop Handbook, and they go from the minis all the way up to the giant pumpkins and the specialty types. This one down at the bottom, Wee One, with 5 E's in it or 4 E's in it, that's still one of my favorite of the minis, because unlike the rest of these, which are technically more gourds than miniature pumpkins, that Wee One, you can actually carve a little tiny pumpkin. So it's kind of fun. I always think of Martha Stewart carving individual placeholders for her friends for dinner parties with that one. And then Lil Pumpkimon, I always call that one the UT variety, because it's going to be a cream color with orange stripes that are coming down. So those are 2 unique ones for the minis, but tons of great pumpkin varieties out there. All right, so 2 crops down, 2 to go. I reference not only the Southeast Vegetable Crop Handbook, which I didn't put the URL for in here. You can just Google Southeast Vegetable Crop Handbook and it'll pop up in various sites, or you can access it from my website. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to for pumpkins is our trial results are on my website there with the at vegetables.tennessee.edu under pumpkin variety trials. So that's a good place to look. And here you can see some of that great pumpkin diversity. This is from a display at Denton Parkins in West Tennessee from a few years ago. Are there any pumpkin questions before we go on to sweet corn?
Hey, Annette, are pumpkins subject to cracking if they have inadequate water, like on a regular basis?
I've never seen that, but I wouldn't put it past them.
Okay.
They're not like a watermelon or anything like that.
Okay, that's what I was kind of wondering about. Like, is it generally best to have, consistent water going to them through fruit set, or if truly they could rely some on rainwater as opposed to irrigation?
Yeah, a lot of folks do dry pumpkin production, so it does work, and I haven't seen them cracking really being an issue. If you can get water to them, that's always better, especially if you're a grower that's selling by the pound, which we still see from time to time. More folks just set a price because it's easier. One less thing they have to deal with is weighing every pumpkin that goes out off the farm. So they generally set them per piece, not per pound. But we do see a few folks that still charge by the pound. If you're charging by the pound, you definitely want to bump up the water, because that's what you're selling. You're selling a big packet of water.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, we're going to move on to sweet corn now. So sweet corn, especially, unlike pumpkins, which we're generally not eating, although we can eat. We're not eating the jack-o'-lanterns because we're carving them up and then they're going to get all nice and moldy inside. But some of those other types are really good eating quality. The maximas and the mochadas are really good eating quality. Great for pumpkin pies that we're all making today or tomorrow. But with sweet corn, there are plenty of varieties out there, and generally enough people growing sweet corn that quality can really differentiate you in the market. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that, because there's a lot of nuances in sweet corn too, unlike some other crops where we see less differences in that quality. So indicators of sweet corn quality from the grower perspective, of course, we want a good stand, we want good vigor, we want good resistance to diseases and insects and stresses, we want to have good crop and ear uniformity, We want it to be easy to harvest. So some corns, you really have to work to get them off the stalk. Others are much more easy to get off the stalk. And then of course, yield is always a driver because that comes back to our bottom line. However, for the consumer, first, they're going to judge it on the appearance at market, right? And that's going to be what they buy or don't buy from. And that's going to include, first of all, if they see worms in the tip, that's a good thing that they're going to go to somebody else. So, oh, there's worms in there. We had an organic grower here in Knoxville at the Knoxville market, and he always said he'd sell his corn for $1 an ear. And he said the worm in the tip showed you that it was organic. So it was a marketing thing for him, but doesn't work for a lot of people. Other things are going to be what the husk or the flag leaf color is, if it's nice and green, if it's not getting dry and shriveled up. The length of the ear people look for, and then the overall tip fill. Is it filled out or do you have some gaps in there? Most consumers aren't looking at the row number and the configuration, but they do look at the silks if they're there and that it looks fresh in the market. But once they get it home, it's the, or am I going to buy it again? Am I going to go back to that vendor next week, or am I going to go to a different one? Because then they're going to look at the flavor and that comes down to the sweetness and the texture mainly, or the tenderness. So those are the two big things they're looking for once they get it home. And what goes into that is sweet corn genetics, which can make your head spin. But what's the difference in a lot of these types? So for each one of these, we're going to go through this a little bit, looking at their sugar at harvest and how fast they convert that sugar into starch after harvest, their texture, and then what they have to be isolated from and how easy are they to produce. So originally we had these normal sugaries, which have moderate sugar at harvest, but they're the ones that we always say you have to put the pot of water on to boil before you go out to harvest, because you want to get them in the water as soon as you get them back in the house, because that starch conversion is going to be really fast. So for a grower that's growing these SU types, well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend growing the SUs. I would recommend one of the newer genetics that we're going to talk about, just so you don't have that where you have to get them sold immediately, because they are going to be ones that are going to get chewy pretty quick and not be as sweet. But their texture is generally going to be creamy, and we have to isolate them from the SH2s, and we'll talk more about isolation in a little bit, but they are easy to produce. Next, we have the sugary enhanced, and these are going to have high sugar at harvest and fairly slow starch conversion. So their texture is also going to be creamy, which is what folks are looking for generally. And they also have to be isolated from those SH2s. They're also fairly easy to grow. So next we have the super sweets, which have even higher sugar at harvest and even slower starch conversion from those sugars to starches. But they came with a crispy texture that a lot of folks didn't like. And the other thing with them is they have to be isolated from everything else. So from the SUs, the SEs, and the synergistic or multi-sweet types. And they're a little more finicky to grow. So they don't like to germinate as well as some of the other types. And they're a little more temperature sensitive. So there's a lot of things going on with them. So then the breeders started crossing some of these. So synergistics are one of the things you'll see. Now you'll see a whole lot more crosses, but again, for the sake of time, we're going to move on from this fairly quickly. The synergistics are going to have that higher sugar at harvest and that slower sugar to starch conversion, but now they have that creamy texture that folks want. You still have to isolate them from the plain old SH2s, even though SH2 is one of their parents, because if you don't, they'll be chewy and more like a field corn. But they're fairly easy to grow like the others and not difficult like the super sweets. So there's a lot in the genetics. That sugar, as I mentioned, goes a long way. And we always have this conversation in in-services and grower meetings about what people are growing. And that goes into the other choices we make. So in addition to the genetics, then we have to choose, are we growing white, yellow, or bicolor? I often tell people if you're growing bicolor, If somebody wants yellow, you're like, yeah, it's bicolor, it has yellow in it. And if they want white, it has some white in it. So it's kind of the middle of the road. So bicolors are probably the predominant type that we see. And we often hear that people are saying they're growing peaches and cream, which are some of those older genetics, not so sweet. And I always say, don't tell people you're growing peaches and cream if it's not peaches and cream, because that'll separate you in the market, and then they'll come back to you and say, oh, this is even better than peaches and cream, and everybody else is growing peaches and cream, whether they really are or not, or just calling it that because that's a variety that people know. However, Walter Battle brought up once that it's just a marketing tool because that's the variety people know. So you sell more if you tell them it's peaches and cream, even if it's not peaches and cream. So I think it could go either way, depending on your marketing skills. The other thing, within each of these colors, we have varieties that are early season, mid-season, and late season. So in theory, this can help stagger out your harvest. Although if you plant them all at the same time, we do tend to see them stack up on each other when it gets hot pretty quick here in Tennessee. So another way to handle that is to just keep staggering your plantings to stagger out the harvest over the full season. The last thing that we consider with corn is whether to use a genetically modified corn or not. And we're going to spend a little time here just because I think this is an area where consumers can sometimes get tripped up, and just so we're all understanding what we're talking about. So attribute, the original attribute was the first form of insect protection that we have. Now we have attribute 2. And I took this directly from Syngenta's website, but they say it's genetically enhanced to provide strong protection against European corn borer and good control of corn earworm and fall armyworm. An important thing to mention when we're talking about attribute or GMO technology with corn is that this is just part of your IPM program. Lots of growers think, if I get this BT corn, I can just plant it and forget it. And that's not the case. You still need to scout and spray because, as it says up there, it has strong protection against European corn borer, but only good control of corn earworm and fall armyworm. So we still want to be scouting and know when we need to spray, but these BT corns can reduce your sprays by 50% or more. They also require a signed stewardship agreement with Syngenta, and there are minimum seed purchasing requirements on them. So to delve into how these work a little more, the gene for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring soil bacterium, is incorporated into these varieties. So it's going to produce that protein in the plant itself. So then when the lepidopteran insects, those worms, the corn earworm, the European corn borer, when they feed on the leaves or the stalk or the silks or the ears themselves, they're going to ingest that protein, it binds to their gut, and then they die within 48 hours. The nice thing about BT is it's harmless to beneficial insects and birds and fish and reptiles and mammals. So it's fine for us. It's not going to cause any harm to anyone. And the bacterium itself, Bacillus thuringiensis, is an important organic input. So it's a tool that organic growers can spray on their corn. However, of course, certified organic growers cannot use genetically modified organisms, so they can't use these varieties, but they can use the BT itself. So that's always an important thing to talk about as well. So with this attribute 2 technology, they have the Liberty Link gene in there as well. And this allows these attribute 2 varieties to be sprayed with herbicides. So either glufosinate or glyphosate. And it's really critical for growers, if they do have these attribute 2 varieties, to make sure that they're reading the label on their herbicides and make sure they're only spraying 100% glufosinate or 100% glyphosate with no other active herbicide ingredients. Otherwise, they'll take out their whole field. So, as I mentioned, those BT varieties are going to give you excellent protection against the caterpillars that are entering the ears at fresh silking, because we have high BT protein in that green silk tissue. Oops, there we go. However, as those silks start to wilt and degrade, the larvae are going to bypass them, and then we're going to see these little guys there in the tip. And they're going to have a better chance to survive in the ear because not all kernels are going to have that Bt protein. And I'll show you a slide on that in a second. So you're going to tend to see more damage likely under that high insect pressure and in hybrids that are lacking that good tip coverage, so that the leaves aren't covering that tip where it's exposed and the larva can get to that tip. And so that's a characteristic we look for in corn trials, that it has good tip cover to prevent those worms from penetrating in there. So the surviving larvae are still going to be sick, but they're not going to develop or feed normally, but they can be present in 25% or more of the ears. So you're still going to see a fair amount of damage. And if you're wholesaling, that's going to make it potentially unmarketable. In a direct market, you have a little more wiggle room. So for late plantings, especially, is when we tend to see this technology kind of where you need to scout more and be on top of things. Early season, you can often get away without spraying as much, but late in the season, you want to make sure that you have 1 or 2 insecticide sprays to prevent that ear damage. So this is what I was talking about. In early attribute varieties, there were only a couple of genes, or one gene that was associated with this Bt trait. It was hemizygous. So what that means is, oh, I think this is one of those fancy slides. In 1 out of every 4 kernels, we would have that Bt protection. So there's a lot of wiggle room for the insects to get in there. With newer technologies, we wouldn't have that Bt protection, excuse me. So if the worms were eaten on one of these, it didn't have the Bt in it. Now, with more genes added to the attribute technology, we only have this one isolated kernel out of all of these that doesn't have that Bt protection in it. So that's what we're saying. In the silks, you have that high protection because all the silks have it, but not so in the ear. And that's why they keep working on this technology, because they're getting it to be better and better over time. So again, recommended varieties, you can find them on page 110 of the Southeast Vegetable Crop Handbook. And if you see, like down here in white for mid-season, Devotion 2, that Roman numeral 2 after it is a sign that it has that Bt protection already in it. So that's what folks look for corn varieties. So getting into the fertility for corn, and I have to really speed up. Corn does the best between pH 6 and 6.8. It's going to require about 120 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Again, we want that in a split application, broadcast and then side dressed. For phosphate, we want 25, 50, 100 pounds per acre. Potash, same thing. And then if our pH is above 6.1, we also want to apply 5 pounds per acre of zinc, because oftentimes we can see some zinc deficiency in corn where the soil does not have enough zinc in the crop. And I'll show you this a little bit later on too. So for sweet corn, when to plant, we want to start planting about the last average frost date in the spring. We want the soil temperatures to be 60 degrees or more. We want to make sure we have adequate moisture. We want to hit our market window. People always want their corn by the 4th of July. And you want to make sure you're doing successive plantings to keep that corn coming in across the season. Of course, if you're wholesaling, you might just want that early corn and be done with it. So it all depends on what the grower's market is and what they're doing. So the planting dates mid to late April, and then every couple of weeks thereafter until maybe early August, but that's when we start seeing a lot of those worms and the drier weather. So it's harder to get a crop off then. Corn spacing, we want to plant our seeds about 8 to 12 inches apart on 30-inch rows. And the seed depth should be about 3/4 to 1.5 inches, depending on your soil conditions. So early in the season, when the soils are colder, we want no more than 1 inch deep. Later, planting a little deeper is going to ensure that we have adequate soil moisture. We also want to make sure we're not planting in long rows, but rather in blocks. And that's going to help our uniformity in pollination because corn is wind pollinated. So if you're planting in a long row, it's a lot harder than if you have a lot of corn in a block together. So I said we'd get back to this isolation part. As I showed you in that diagram earlier, cross-pollination from other types of sweet corn can give you those starchy, chewy kernels that we're trying to avoid. So as I mentioned, the SE and the synergistic types, we want to isolate from each other as well as from other types of corn. So if somebody's growing more than one variety, they want to make sure they know the genetics of those and isolate them as they need to, but you also want to isolate them from field corn or popcorn or any ornamental corn. That isolation can be either by distance or by maturity. So distance, you'll see anything from 250 feet up to here it says 700 to 1,000 feet from other corns. I would just caution the more distance, the better. We all know that pollen is tiny, it can travel. So the more distance between these varieties, the better off you'll be. If you're isolating by maturity, you want to make sure that you have a difference in maturity of at least 10 to 14 days between the varieties. But again, the maturity dates can kind of squeeze down on each other as the season heats up. So for me, distance is more of a better bet for isolation than maturity, because even if you have a 10-day difference in maturity, those can mature way faster than you think, and you can run into issues sometimes. But again, it's going to depend on how much space somebody has to devote to their corn. So irrigation, again, can be critical during these critical periods. At planting, we want to have it for herbicide activation and also for germinating the seed. Generally, it's early enough in the season that it's going to get some good overhead irrigation from the rain early on in the season. We also want to make sure that when it's 12 to 18 inches tall, it's getting some water, and then it's silking and ear fill, because again, we want to fill out those ears. So the recommended amount is going to be 1 inch or more per acre per week. More and more we see folks transplanting sweet corn, and that's first of all because we can have poor germination in cool soils in the spring, especially for those SH2 varieties, which are a little more finicky. Also, if we're transplanting early in the season, that can help with that earworm pressure. So we can get out of there before the earworms really ramp up. And then lastly, for direct marketing, you can set the price early in the season because you have corn before everyone else does. So that's a good tactic for farmers markets and produce auctions. So we're going to run through this transplanting system because it is a little different. And Tim Coulong, who used to be at the University of Kentucky, he's now at the University of Georgia, did some trials on this that I thought were interesting and you might be interested in too. So transplanting is generally only going to be done for that first planting. So we're getting that high market share and we're trying to avoid those worms. In Tennessee, we transplant in late March or early April. So we're going to get in there earlier, and then we're going to harvest in June, early to mid-June. And we're going to have a very short window for planting. So if somebody's doing a transplanting system, they want to avoid the varieties that mature in 72 days or less. They're not going to do well. They're going to tassel out and you're not going to get a good yield off of them. We've seen this here on some of those early maturing varieties where they start tasseling out where they're 2 feet tall. So not good for overall yield. Growing the transplants for your corn can be the most important part of the system because you also have a very narrow window for transplant production. Unlike some of the other crops where we're growing them for weeks and weeks, it's a short time where we're growing these corn transplants. And the transplant, like any other transplant, is going to be affected by the cell size and that transplant age and the maturity of the corn, whether it's early, mid, or late. So generally, we're going to plant 2 seeds per cell in 128 cell trays. So that's going to give us 256 plants per tray. If folks are using a smaller cell tray, 200 cell tray, they're only going to do 1 seed per cell. But you can have more of an issue in a 200 cell tray with stunting if they're left in the tray too long. So this is some interesting stuff on 3 varieties where he looked at the height to tassel according to how long they grew the transplants. So the height to tassel was the highest, 42 inches, and we'll just look at the top variety here. If it was seeded, if we were transplanting, we got less than half that height when it tasseled for 17-day transplant, and for a 24-day transplant, it was similar. It wasn't quite as bad with some of these other varieties, so Synergy and Providence, and that's because this top variety is one of those early maturing types, the 65 days, so really short when it starts tasseling out. These are more reasonable down at the bottom, so Providence is an 80-day maturing variety. And you do see some difference, but it's not as drastic as those early maturing varieties. So they grew transplants for 13, 15, 17, 20, 22, and 24 days. And you can see the differences in maturity dates for the varieties that they grew. And they looked at transplant treatments that had at least a 7-inch ear. For that early maturing variety, no age of transplant made it to a 7-inch ear. But you can see for these later maturing varieties, you had 7-inch ears with all of the transplant dates. However, this is transplant age, so the younger a transplant was, and this is maturity, so more maturity, 80-day varieties versus young varieties or early maturing varieties. And you can see we get better ear development with a shorter transplant age and a longer days to maturity. You can see a lot of holes, so not good pollination down at this end. We have some skips, and these are nice uniform ears here on the left-hand side. So what he found from his study was that the days to harvest really wasn't affected by the transplant system, except for those longest maturing types. So for example, Synergy still took 76 days from seeding, whether it was direct seeded or transplanted, but a 17-day-old transplant was ready a couple weeks earlier than that direct seeded treatment. So we could get it in the field and get it back out because we had those 17 days in the greenhouse versus the field. So his transplant recommendations: don't transplant anything less than 72 days for maturity. He really didn't get good quality until 76 days varieties. Don't keep the transplants more than 20 days unless you're growing one of those late maturing varieties. And they found the results were similar for East and Central Kentucky in spring and summer. So the summer crop had taller plants and better yields. So the transplanting system, it's plastic mulch with a raised bed. So we're going to have drip irrigation under there as well. It's going to be on a double row with 9 to 12 inch in-row spacing. Again, 2 plants per hole. We're just taking them right out of that flat. Gives us a population of about 28,000 per acre, and we get about 1 good ear per plant. So there's a variety of transplanters that folks can use for this, but similar to some of the other vegetable crops. This is showing their fields 17 days after planting, and you'll note that they have the row cover right next to the crop because we are getting it in early to get it out early. You want to make sure that you have some row cover available to cover it up on those cold nights so it doesn't get damaged. Another option that's going to be more expensive, but is to have these little low tunnels or plastic tunnels, and they can give you about 2 to 3 degrees of protection from frost, but they can get really warm, just like a high tunnel can, more than 40 degrees warmer on a sunny day than the ambient temperature. So that's something you have to watch out for as well, because crops never like to be too hot. I'm going to skip over that. If we're changing up our fertility for these transplants, we want to make sure we have 75 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre pre-plant. And then, since we already have that drip there, we can fertigate weekly with 15 to 20 pounds of nitrogen. This can be hard because we're growing these in the spring when it's already going to be wet from a lot of rain. So that's something to take into account as well. And we can see problems with zinc deficiency because the soil is going to be cool. So his recommendation was to add 6 to 12 pounds of zinc sulfate to the setter water. Other things with sweet corn, we have increased suckering if it's on plastic, increased chances of it lodging, but we also have the ability to double crop like we talked about with pumpkin. So when do you know to harvest corn? When the pollination silks are dried, when the husk leaves are nice and tight and green, when the ear is firm and turgid before the raccoons get in there, should be another one. The kernels plump and milky. The raccoons seem to know the exact day that they're at their perfect stage for harvest. So another indicator is 17 to 18 days after silking or 21 days after tasseling. The USDA standards for corn, they're judged by freshness and the uniform appearance, those well-filled rows, plumpness of the kernels, milky kernels, and freedom from damage and defects. We also want to make sure we're harvesting this carefully to prolong the quality. Again, harvest in the early morning when there's higher moisture and lower temperatures. Corn is another one that is a high respiring crop. You want to snap the ear downward and away from the main stalk, and then you might have to trim the flag leaves and the stalk ends, depending on how it came off. Then you want to sort, remove all the defects. You can either pack in wire-bound crates, as you see here, cabbage bags, or wax cartons. So that's going to be mainly buyer-driven. As I mentioned, it's high respiring, so cooling is really going to be key. When you harvest, get it out of the sun as soon as possible, and then get it in low temperature because that's going to slow down that conversion of sugar to starch. The optimum temperature for corn is going to be 32 to 34. The loss of sugar can be 4 times less at 32 than even 50 degrees. So it's really dramatic if you can keep it cool and get that field heat out of it, or not let the field heat build up. And this just shows that loss of sugar in storage. So within 1 day, if you're keeping it at ambient temperature, you've lost more than 60% of your sugar. If you're keeping it at 0, over 4 days, you've only lost about 20% of your sugar. So it does make a dramatic difference. And if someone is a full-on sweet corn grower, investing in cooling is a very valuable investment. Again, if you're just growing corn, hydro cooling makes a lot of sense. And that's drenching or immersing it in near freezing water. And hydro cooling is going to cool things down the fastest. So if we set it in a cold room, we're going to suffer from slow cooling, but we're also going to suffer from dehydration. So hydro cooling is going to cool it fast. And because we're cooling in water, we're not getting that dehydration or water loss from the crop. Another thing folks can do is top icing. This can get messy, but generally, if you're trying it for corn, a pound of ice for 5 pounds of sweet corn is a standard, but you're still going to need cooling. You can't just ice it and leave it out in room temperature. Well, I said we want to get it down to 32. Freezing injury is going to start at 31, so there's a very narrow window there. And some of the symptoms of that freezing injury are going to be water-soaked patches on the husks, and water-soaked kernels or gelatinous kernels, and you'll get off odors. So even those super sweet varieties are best when they're eaten as soon as after harvest as possible. Some varieties can lose more than half their sugar content in a day. Harvest and handle them carefully. The sooner you get it to their customers and they get it home, the more repeat customers you'll have. All right, so now I am at my time limit and I haven't gotten to tomatoes. So Margarita, I'm going to kick it over to you to take over. We'll get you all these slides if we don't make it back. Sorry about that. There's just too much stuff to cover in here.
Annette, I mean, if you need the extra, I know agents appreciate the production tips that you give them. So I don't know if in maybe 10 minutes, you can go through some of the key things for tomatoes. I can adjust my presentation. No problem. It's
Will
up
that be
to you.
fine? Well,
Yeah.
we can do a whirlwind of tomatoes. Does everybody want to do that?
I'll leave that any way y'all want to go. Thank you.
All right, I forget if I stopped sharing my screen, did I?
Yeah, you stop sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. Let me get out of here a second because I can't even see the Zoom now. All right, let me share it again. There we go. Let me get back into, oh. All right, so we're gonna whiz through this. Again, tons of varieties of tomatoes. We'll skip through that. You can find those varieties for heirlooms and aromas and grapes and everything in the handbook on pages 116 and 117. Transplants, I threw a little in here on transplants because I think there's a lot of advantages for folks growing their own transplants. The main things are you can decide the variety or cultivar rather than relying on what other people might have that they've grown. And it also helps with determining the size of your transplants. You can make sure they're nice and healthy and vigorous. It also reduces your chances of getting diseases that might come in from the transplant grower that you're using. And they're available when you need them, because you can just get them right, have them grown when you need them, work it out. We did a whole workshop on seed sources and transplants back in 2009 in our organic workshop series. But if folks want information on transplant production, that's still up and it's a good resource. So I put that down there at the bottom. Hardening off is really critical if you are growing your own transplants. And I wanted to talk about this briefly because the traditional wisdom was hardening off by sticking them outside for about a week before we're going to plant them in the field. And newer research shows that if you're exposing tomatoes to cool temperatures, so 60 to 65 degree days and 50 to 60 degree nights, that can cause more cap facing if they're out there for a week or more. So what we tend to do, you can either harden transplants off by withholding your water, so allowing the plants to wilt slightly between light waterings. Don't harden them off by withholding fertilizer. That'll just give you weak transplants that'll suffer a little once you get them in the field. The other thing we do is we put them out during the day, but we bring them back into the greenhouse at night, so they're not getting those cooler 50-degree night temperatures. So other options, if folks don't want to grow their own transplants, there are local growers all across Tennessee that specialize in growing transplants for other folks. I know we have some in Granger County and other places, so that's an option. We also have a lot of transplant producers in North Carolina, Georgia, and Kentucky. So those are good resources depending on where you're located to point your growers to. pH, just like with the other crops, the proper pH range for tomato is going to be between 6 and 6.8. 6.5 is ideal, and that's going to ensure we have good nutrient availability. Again, we want to reduce that incidence of fusarium wilt. Where we get on this lower end, we have more issues with fusarium. You've all seen this before, so we won't dwell on that. I'm not going to dwell on the fertility tables either. There's more exciting stuff in here to get to. Planting dates. Again, we're going to get in there as soon as the frost-free date is over for our first planting, and that's going to be on black plastic. And then generally we're going to switch to white plastic for early summer and for summer to fall, because it's going to be hot by then, and we want to make sure that we're keeping those young transplants cool instead of frying them on the black plastic. Tomato spacing, that's going to be dictated by your equipment, but also by your variety and the training system that we're using. So it's going to vary. That Florida weave system, I wanted to talk about it a little bit because we often hear about it and not everybody might be familiar with it. But this is just a form of trellising the tomatoes, and it's probably the most popular way to trellis your tomatoes. But you're going to place a stake either every other plant or every plant, and then you're going to use wood or metal T-posts. Wood, the issue with them is if you do have soil-borne diseases, there's no good way to clean them after you have those soil-borne diseases like southern blight. You can't really sanitize wood because it's open cells, so that's something to consider. We've gone to all metal T-posts on the organic farm just because we can sanitize them between seasons. But the important thing is you want those stakes as tall or taller than the final plant height. So aim high. And you're going to start this trellising when the plants are about a foot tall. So you want to make sure you're using tomato twine because it's not going to cut into the plants. Some folks like to use some sort of cheap string they might have around, and it's not going to hold the plants as well, and it can tend to cut into the plants. So you're going to twine it around the end, tie it off, and then you're going to weave it around the plants about 6 to 8 inches off the ground for that first row, and then you're going to wrap it around the end of the row and weave back the other direction so the plants have this nice string holding them in. And then you're going to repeat the process for every 6 to 8 inches of growth. Irrigation, critical for tomato, high value crop. They're going to need 1 inch of water per week at transplanting, and then 2 to 2.5 inches when the fruit are developing. This is more on irrigation scheduling. We're going to skip over that. We're going to talk a little bit about pruning. So pruning can be important to balance that vine and fruit growth. If we have no pruning, that's going to give us a heavy load of smaller fruit. So for pruning, and this is a nice diagram from the University of Wisconsin, we're going to remove all the suckers except the one immediately below that first flower cluster. So here you can see the sucker coming right out from the soil. We're going to get that one off. Then we have this sucker right above the first leaflet. We're going to remove it, but we're going to let this first one under that flower cluster stay. Another thing about pruning is you want to make sure you're getting to them when the suckers are no more than 2 to 4 inches long. And the reason for that is if the suckers are already large, when you try to get them off the plant, they can damage the plant. And you're also going to have a really large wound left where you took them off the plant. So that can introduce disease. Ideally, you want to do your pruning before that first stringing, because having to deal with all those strings and finding the suckers in amongst the strings can really slow down the process. Pruning is also going to be variety and fertility dependent, so you want to keep that in mind as well. I did want to talk a little bit about grafting because we see more and more interest in grafting. Grafting can give us greater crop vigor. It can give us greater total yield throughout the season. It can also lengthen our harvest window. And for things like watermelon, it can give us larger, sweeter fruit. For tomato, it can give us more lycopene sometimes as well. We also can use grafted plants to limit the negative effects of soil salinity. And this is increasingly important in environments like high tunnels where we see salt buildup over time. And we're going to talk about high tunnels maybe very briefly. So grafting can help with disease and also nematodes. But grafting is really going to complicate your variety selection because now you need the rootstock and a scion, and it's going to increase your transplant cost because you're buying twice as much seed, and you need even more to make sure you get enough plants that have a good graft. It can increase your disease transmission potential because you are cutting and putting things together, and so you want to make sure everything is done in a clean fashion as much as possible. And there's a lot of questions around grafting still. We're still in fairly early days with this. So we know a lot about resistance and tolerances to selected diseases and nematodes, and there's great charts. I'm going to skip ahead there, but we don't know as much about tolerances to different abiotic stressors or effects on foliar disease or other cropping practices like reduced tillage. This is the rootstock database that's run from the grafting project, and it is updated quarterly, I believe, but it has all the characteristics somebody might be looking for in a rootstock. So in our case, southern blight is an important thing to have resistance to. As you can see in this screenshot, there aren't any that have resistance to southern blight, but there are some in this database that do have resistance to southern blight. Folks can graft themselves, or again, there's some growers that are specializing in this. We're very fortunate to have Triistal in Western North Carolina, and they will produce grafted transplants for folks. And you can give them the scion and the rootstock that you want to use, and they will graft it for you. I believe they have a 1,000 plant minimum for them to do it for you. So for smaller growers, they can kind of get together and make an order together. But just like with anything else, you have to adjust your practices to get the most from these plants. Important things are keeping the graft union above the soil line, because if you don't, then it's like you didn't graft at all. You'll get some adventitious rooting from the scion. And then if you are grafting for a soil-borne disease, it'll get that soil-borne disease again with those adventitious roots. So that's a whirlwind on grafting. Couple slides on high tunnels, because I'd be remiss in not talking about high tunnels with tomatoes. It's the most common crop we grow in a high tunnel because it's profitable. And this is our high tunnel at the organic farm. You can see our metal T-post there. But especially in Tennessee, between the NRCS EQUIP program and the Tennessee Ag Enhancement Program, folks can basically get a free high tunnel. And high tunnels really help with year-round income, increasing your yield and quality because we're keeping the rain off the crop, getting you higher prices because we're extending that season outside of the normal window. So again, like with the sweet corn, if you're in a high tunnel, you're getting the first tomatoes on the market. It can help with keeping your workers employed. And as I mentioned, there are cost share programs to get folks started. However, with season extension, it is increased management. There's no vacation, year-round work. You have higher production to start, and of course the plastic disposal issue. But I think growers are pretty innovative and use that plastic for other things. So I think everybody's familiar with high tunnels, but in case you're not, it is an unheated greenhouse, basically, that you can drive a tractor in or stand up in. It's solar heated, so there aren't heating costs. A lot of people do put supplemental heaters in their tunnels now, but crops are grown directly into the ground with drip irrigation. And the cost of these, it's gone up because of the pandemic, but it used to be $1.50 to $3 or less per square foot. So they're very economical compared to, say, a fully automated greenhouse. Some growers say that they can pay for themselves in one season. This is a dated slide now. It's data from 2000 or 2001, but this is from Wild Onion Farm in Kansas, and they grow a lot of cut flowers, and they show you the revenue per square foot inside these tunnels. It always pains me to show this as the vegetable specialist, but the cut flowers tend to be very profitable in the tunnel, but tomato is right up there. So a good tomato grower can get $3.55 per square foot in a high tunnel. All right, that was a whirlwind of tomatoes. Again, reference the Vegetable Crop Handbook. For grafting resources, there's a grafting guide and that rootstock database at www.vegetablegrafting.org.
Annette,
Right.
Kenny had a quick question. Kenny Herndon, do you rotate crops in high tunnels to prevent diseases?
That's a great question, Kenny. And ideally, yes, you do. But folks don't want to give up those high value crops. So what we see most often, if they're rotating, it's a tomato lettuce rotation. And that's really where a lot of problems arise because folks get the most value from those crops. So they want to keep growing them year after year. And over time, we see soil-borne diseases building up as well as salt and other things. One way to get around that is movable tunnels, which I didn't get into, but movable tunnels can really help with that because you can move the whole tunnel. It's going to be a shorter tunnel, but you can move it around, which really opens up your rotation options, and you can rotate in cover crops and other things, and it makes it a lot easier. So yes, ideally you rotate, but we don't often see that in tunnels. All right, Margarita. Sorry to take up your time. You're on mute.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go ahead and go really quick through my presentation. Key things for those of you who do not know me yet. My name is Margarita Velandia. I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. I'm the one who has developed all the fruit and vegetable budgets we have available right now with the help of our plant science collaborators, including Annette Wszelaki and David Lockwood. Really quick, what I'm going to be presenting today are two of the main questions you usually get from farmers. How much should I charge for my crop? And the second questions you guys get is, where can I get an enterprise budget? So those are the two things I'm going to be covering today. Prices, enterprise budgets, where to find them, and how to use them. All right. Okay. So before we go through the general reasons why it is important to develop and use enterprise budgets, I want to start my presentation with a quote from Karen McSwain, Associate Executive Director for Programs of the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. If you can't pencil a profit, you are unlikely to make one. So this quote highlights the importance of enterprise budgets as a tool that could help farmers pencil a profit and therefore help farmers accomplish their goal of making a profit. This slide is one that I usually share with growers. So this slide clearly represents the role of enterprise budgets in identifying the stage farmers are in on their current reality curve. So you probably get some phone calls from those farmers that are in the naive enthusiasm stage, where they may be thinking that they can definitely make a profit by growing and selling tomatoes at the farmers market, until they realize they have to pay their $50 annual fee to participate in the farmers market. They have to pay their $10 booth fee every time they attend a market. They drive 30 minutes to the farmers market, spend 30 minutes more setting up their booth, realize that there are 10 more vendors also selling tomatoes, and after sitting for 3 hours at the market, they have sold only 2 pounds of tomatoes. So enterprise budgets may take farmers from the naive enthusiasm stage to the more on-track, somewhat hopeful stage without having to go through the rude awakening stage. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of like skip this slide, because this will show you something that you already know. So the reasons why should farmers develop and use crop enterprise budgets. So we know they should develop crop enterprise budgets to help them determine whether their resources and labor they invest in a crop are actually generating a profit. Enterprise budgets are also useful in projecting yield, specifically marketable yield, as well as products sold, income, expenses, and profits for a single crop per year. So some of you, when looking for crop enterprise budgets, have found those budgets developed by various university extension services. The biggest mistake we see farmers making is to use these example budgets as they are, instead of personalizing them for their own farm. It is important to know that these budgets are only an indication of what a particular crop could average over time and location in terms of net returns. Furthermore, it is important to know that individual farms' results could vary greatly from the university extension crop enterprise budgets because of differences in soil, location, market, and farmer managerial ability, among others. In this presentation, I'm going to show you an example of how a sweet corn enterprise budget from the University of Kentucky will deviate from an actual farm enterprise budget. So now we're going to look at all the components of an enterprise budget and the steps we need to follow when building these enterprise budgets. First, we're going to look at the gross revenue component of the enterprise budget. That's the one that farmers usually like to look at before they look at their expenses. So the gross revenue is going to be simply product sold times price. So let's look at the price component of gross revenue. A question farmers usually ask us is how much they should charge for their tomatoes, asparagus, sweet corn, or pumpkins. There are 3 factors they need to take into consideration when setting their prices: cost of production and marketing, what customers might be willing to pay for their products, and competitors' prices. Traditionally, farmers use information about competitors' prices to set their prices. This is usually a good strategy as long as producers know and understand their cost of production and marketing. So some of you might be familiar with the farmers markets price reports. We've been collecting prices for probably the past 5 to 6 years. So this is a very good tool to kind of like assess how much they should be charging for their product. So for example, in this first table I'm presented on this slide, we can see the 3-year average prices between 2016 and 2019 for tomatoes, yellow squash, and beans for 4 counties. So you can see in this slide that prices in Knox County are traditionally higher than those prices paid in other counties listed in this table. These differences are associated, of course, with location, which may determine consumers' household incomes, level of education, and therefore willingness to pay for produce. Although we did not report prices in 2020 and 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, average prices from previous years are still useful in determining produce prices, as prices have not really changed dramatically in the past few years. Okay, So using farmers markets price reports to price these other products like asparagus. So tomatoes are kind of like easy. Majority of farmers are actually selling the tomatoes on a per pound basis. So it's kind of like fairly easy to use the farmers markets price reports to have a reference price. On the other hand, farmers markets price reports can be difficult to use when you're trying to price products such as asparagus, sweet corn, and pumpkins. So for example, for asparagus, the only two markets we had that reported prices for asparagus was Knox and Rutherford counties. So and then of course you see that they're listed on a per bunch basis, right? Now for pumpkins, prices vary traditionally by size, and it is difficult to assess what some farmers consider a small, medium, or large pumpkin. For sweet corn, there is homogeneity in prices across locations. On average, farmers have priced their sweet corn at $5 per dozen. So we have that variation in between $4 and $6 per dozen. But on average, we see here the $5 per dozen. And if you visit a farmer's market, you can confirm that information. At the bottom of this slide, you will find the link to the Tennessee Farmers Markets price reports. We report these prices on a weekly basis for about 20 weeks. We are planning to resume our farmers markets price reports in 2022. And if any of you are interested in becoming a price reporter, that will be very helpful. We currently only have 5 reporters, including me. So if you are interested, please do not hesitate to email me. Okay, so the first enterprise budget I'm going to go through is the current University of Tennessee sample budget for small-scale tomato operations. On the top of this slide, you will find the link to that enterprise budget, or to the University of Tennessee crop enterprise budget. So the tomato budget, we actually developed this budget in 2015, and I'm in the process of updating those default input prices. So they are currently not updated, but they are probably going to be updated by the end of this year, which is like a month from now. Since this is a sample budget, there are some assumptions we had to make to develop the budget. We assume this is a small operation and that is located in East Tennessee. You can select the number of vegetable crops the farmer is growing and selling to farmers markets. So this budget only is targeting those growers that are selling those tomatoes to the farmers markets. The number of vegetable crops you select will affect marketing costs, as the farmers markets marketing cost would be split among all products sold to the farmers market. This budget only would estimate the marketing cost associated with selling produce to only one farmer's market. So this is restricted to the cost associated to selling tomatoes to one farmer's market. The land unit of this sample budget is 1,000 square feet block rather than an acre. We are assuming that tomatoes are grown in East Tennessee in the open field, using plasticulture, so we are not assuming that they are grown in high tunnels. We are assuming the varieties grown are traditionally round red determined types such as Empire and Celebrity. And one of the things that you need to note is it's important to know that many scale operations use indeterminate varieties. So this particular detail or this culture would entail a different trellis system and a longer harvest period. So budgets for indeterminate varieties would include greater yield, but also higher cost. And that higher cost is going to be related to the trellising system and the labor related to trellising and marketing. You can assume a different space between rows and plants than the ones that we are assuming here, but you should manually change the number of plants per acre in the main enterprise budget. Or in other words, you might change the space between plants and rows, but that's not automatically going to change the number of plants per 1,000 square feet that you have there. Okay, so we're going to describe each of the components of the variable cost included in this example. We start with the cost of the tomato plants. Given the space between plants and between rows, we're assuming 100 tomato plants per acre. So how did we come up with the cost per tomato plant as we estimated it? So we actually look at the cost per plant in some nurseries and other farms from Tennessee and surrounding states, would allow minimum orders of 150 plants or less. Again, because we only have that 1,000 square feet space, again, we are not going to need a lot of plants. But so the majority of the suppliers are going to give you a price discount if you have large orders. If you have small orders, you might not have access to that price discount. Now, based on interviews with 2 tomato producers located in East Tennessee, we include a plant starter mixture, calcium nitrate and potassium nitrate as the fertilizer products of the tomato sample budget. We assume that no lime is needed based on soil test results. And again, we assume a general purpose plant started NPK ratio of 20-20-20. However, as Annette mentioned, of course, appropriate NPK proportions are going to be determined by the soil test results and therefore might vary from operation to operation. One of the things that you need to consider here is that if you go to any local supplier, the plant starter is going to be sold on 25-pound bags, and then the potassium and calcium nitrates are going to be sold on 50-pound bags. That's the unit of cell. So again, even this sample budget only, for example, is saying that I need only 7 pounds of calcium nitrate for that 1,000 square feet of tomatoes. But of course, I'm not going to be buying 7 pounds. I'm going to be buying the 50-pound bag. So that's something that a grower has to be aware of and take into consideration when estimating cost of production. Now, of course, insect and weed plant pressure may vary from operation to operation. Therefore, different products may be applied based on the specific problem. In our sample budget, we suggest some products for weed and insect control that should be used as examples rather than recommendations. Regarding fungicides, the products listed in these sample budgets are components of a spray program considered to be a minimum requirement for successful control of foliar diseases. Again, these recommendations will vary based on the specific situation of the farm. We are assuming because this is a very small unit of production, fumigants are not going to be necessary. But again, this is going to vary from farm to farm. Of course, since we're assuming this is a plasticulture production system, we're going to have costs associated with plastic mulch, stakes, and twine or string. One of the key things for those of you who are familiar with plastic mulch, you know that usually they sell these plastic mulch rolls on a 4 by 4,000 feet basis, and we're talking about a cost of anywhere between $100 and $120 per roll. But of course, I don't need 4 by 4,000 feet rolls to cover 1,000 square feet. I'm only going to need about 800 square feet of plastic. So again, that's another thing that farmers need to take into consideration when they're purchasing their inputs. We assume that these operations uses a drip irrigation system. Then the cost associated with irrigation in the sample budget includes only drip tape. We did not estimate the cost of water. Nonetheless, the cost of water, even though we didn't include the cost of water in this budget, if a farm has no access to a well, which I've seen that case, the cost of using municipal water can be fairly high. And so that's something that producers need to take into consideration. So tomatoes, similar to most of other vegetables, are labor-intensive crop. Therefore, a separate section for labor is included in the sample budget. This is a cost that is difficult to estimate to some growers. So we have reference numbers as far as the hours associated with pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest activities. And so those labor requirements for this sample budget were estimated based on farmer interviews and conversations that I had with Dr. Wislast. There might be additional labor associated with plastic removal and other end-of-season cleanup that is not included in this sample budget, but should be considered when estimating net returns over variable costs. The interesting part about the sample budget is that we have a whole section for marketing costs. So when selling to farmers markets, I need to consider my annual fee, my booth fee, my higher labor crates, gas and fuel related to traveling from my farm to farmers markets and back from the farmers markets to my farm. So that's a really good tool for farmers to use. Okay, so one of the things that you're gonna notice on that sample budget is that we do not calculate fixed costs, for one thing, and the other thing is that we assume open field, right? So, why are we doing that? Because we rely on the assumption that this farm is renting land and most likely custom hires some activities, and therefore there are no large investments in equipment and land in the sample budget. Now, it is important to estimate what we call the fixed cost. If the farmer incurs in any, to have a realistic evaluation of the potential net returns a specific crop will offer the farmer. So also, as Annette mentioned, high tunnel tomatoes have become a very popular production system. And so therefore, I'm giving you an alternative enterprise that you can use. So what we see in this slide, on the top of this slide, you have a link to the Iowa State University enterprise budget for high tunnel tomatoes. So even though this tomato was developed using information from 6 farms in Iowa, the production systems for high tunnel tomatoes are really not that different from what we are doing here in Tennessee. So this enterprise budget is useful and you can share it with your growers. Okay, so in this example, what I have on this slide, you can see is these are high tunnel tomatoes grown in 30 by 96 high tunnels. Those tomatoes are sold through a farmer's market and to restaurants. A couple of things to notice in the annual expenses are, for this example, the farmer is not using fertilizer, rather they're using composted manure from the farm. And so therefore there are only labor costs associated with composted manure. The cost associated with the trellis system is the one in this budget that is called the cages cost. Okay, now let's focus on ownership costs. As I mentioned before, ownership costs might be difficult to estimate, but it is very important, specifically depreciation costs. So we were having a conversation with Annette the other day about the importance of including depreciation. So estimating depreciation costs for high tunnels and plastic covers is important to make sure the farm business is putting money aside each year to guarantee the money will be available when needed to replace high tunnels and plastic covers. One of the most interesting elements of this enterprise budget is that it has a separate spreadsheet for marketing costs. The estimated total marketing cost by market outlet, in this case, farmers markets and restaurants. They allocate marketing costs for tomatoes by estimating total marketing costs by market outlet and then multiplying those costs by the percentage of total sales associated with tomato sales. And this is a very realistic kind of like information. If you ask a farmer total sales and what percentage of those sales might be related to tomatoes, they will be able to at least give you an estimate. So this is actually a good tool. Okay, let's transition to sweet corn. Since we do not have a University of Tennessee sweet corn budget, you could use the University of Kentucky sweet corn budgets as a guide to help Tennessee farmers interested in estimating cost of production and net returns for sweet corn. The University of Kentucky has a small scale and a large scale sweet corn budget. Those budgets are almost identical. The only difference is that they use different scales. The large scale is going to be based on 1 acre and the small scale is going to be based on 0.1 acres. Another difference is that they use different units to estimate net returns. For the small scale budget, they use 1,000 of sweet corn as a unit of production, while for the large scale budget, they use crates of sweet corn per unit of production. On the top of this slide, you will find links to the general enterprise budgets and also links to the PDF copies of the large and small scale budgets. So I showed these budgets to my graduate student who he happens to also grow sweet corn in Tennessee he has been growing sweet corn for the past 8 years in 1 acre. He thought the budget was useful in estimating production costs and net returns. He found it challenging, as most farmers will find it, estimating fixed costs, but doable if finding the right information. On this slide, I'm showing the exercise we did with my student, estimating net returns for his 1 acre of sweet corn using the University of Kentucky Enterprise Budget Guidelines. I used the budget generator from Mississippi State University to help him estimate machinery, variable, and fixed costs. So as you can see on the right-hand side, I mean, that's a fairly high return to land capital and management. We're talking about on 1 acre, he's selling his sweet corn for $5 per dozen. He's selling it on the side, on a roadside stand. He's investing minimum in marketing as he has established reputation among neighbors. He says that it takes him 2 to 3 days to actually sell his sweet corn. And he doesn't invest on crates or anything. He basically recycles boxes, and that's how he takes the sweet corn from the field to the roadside stand. So he's talking about $762. And this is me helping him estimate that fixed cost and depreciation based on the equipment he told me he was using for his sweet corn. He didn't talk about insects. He said, we don't have a lot of insect problems. What we do have is problems with weeds, specifically Johnson grass. And so they said it's challenging to kill that grass without killing the corn. So that's his major problem, and that's kind of like the cost that we associate there. So again, useful tool. This is an example of how to use it in a real, with a real farmer. Okay, now we're going to talk about asparagus enterprise budgets. The best sample budget you can share with farmers interested in growing asparagus is the University of Kentucky's asparagus sample budget. On the top of this slide, you will find the link to the sample enterprise budget. Farmers need to be aware that, as Annette explained in her presentation, asparagus is a perennial crop and not an annual crop. Therefore, they will not have a crop to sell until the year after planting. In the University of Kentucky sample budget, they assume year 0 is the year where farmers build up or prepare the soil. Year 1 is when farmers will be planting the asparagus, and then they will not have a crop until the year 2. Okay. Now, also, we have the Iowa State University enterprise budgets. You have the link on the top of this slide. They do have an enterprise budget, but that only represents when you are in full production of asparagus. This will show you your cost of production, your potential revenue, and your marketing cost. In this case, you have an example on where this farmer is selling asparagus to farmers markets, restaurants, and a food truck. And then on the right-hand side, what I like about these budgets is that they break down those marketing costs. Okay, so to end my presentation, we're going to talk about pumpkin enterprise budgets. One of the things we need to understand when developing a pumpkin enterprise budget is that we need to know what the estimated gross revenue is going to be affected by the estimated price and product sold. And of course, this is going to vary depending on whether you're selling pumpkins wholesale, retail, and pick your own. Okay. Another element to consider when building pumpkin enterprise budgets is the unit of sale. As Annette said, most of the farmers are selling these pumpkins on a per unit basis and not a per pound. Nonetheless, if you make the math and use the enterprise budget and it makes sense for your profits to be selling on a per pound basis, then you should be selling on a per pound basis, knowing that there is going to be a cost associated with having somebody in the register weighing every single pumpkin that they're going to be selling there. Benton Parkins has an owner system in West Tennessee that he basically lets the customers pick their pumpkins, and he has a box where they can deposit the money on that box. That owner system saves you a lot of labor on the marketing side. On the other side, you have to have a trust relationship with your customers and knowing that you're going to have some losses because we have some people that are not going to be honest. So they might be putting less money or they're going to be paying less for what they actually purchased.
The University of Kentucky Small-Scale Pumpkin Budget is a good tool to share with farmers interested in growing pumpkins to estimate production costs and net returns associated with pumpkin production. On the top of this slide, you will find the two links, and that will take you to the General University of Kentucky Vegetable Budgets, and the second link will take you to the PDF copy of the Pumpkin Enterprise Budget. One of the elements to take into consideration is that we have growers in Tennessee that do not grow pumpkins on plastic mulch. So of course, you're not gonna be taking into consideration the plastic mulch cost, and you're not gonna be including the mulch disposal cost, and because they're not gonna be relevant in this case. And with that, I'll end my presentation. In this final slide is the first link will take you to the Tennessee Enterprise Crop Budget. You're gonna find budgets for tomatoes, peppers, blueberries, and we're gonna release the blackberry budget sometime in mid-December, so just to make you aware of that. And with that, I'll end my presentation, and I will answer any questions if there are any at this point.
Any questions from anyone on either subject that we went through, the production or the economic side? I don't see anything else in the chat box. I know a couple had to jump off at 11 Central Time. Just want to say thanks to everyone for being here. I think you got a lot of information, a lot of things thrown at you. Hopefully we'll have the recording available soon. I'll let you know where that will be. Possibly the slides. I don't know how we might want to work that, Annette or Margarita. We didn't do that with the hops, but we might offer that. I did get something in the chat box about wanting the slides for reference. We can look at that. But just thank everyone for being here today. Annette, Margarita, thank you for the work and putting all that on for us. Lots of things in kind of in a short amount of time in a way, but certainly appreciate your work and all that you're doing for us on these projects. So I know in the Eastern time zone, it's lunchtime. Central, we're getting close to that. I did see with those in attendance, there's 4 or 5 that not registered in Super, but I'll try to take care of that for you so you'll get credit for being here today. And just a quick reminder of our next meeting on December the 10th with strawberries, blueberries, and blackberries at 9 a.m. If you hadn't registered for that, please do so as well. And I'll send you a brief link, a link for a brief evaluation to the agents this afternoon as well. So anything else from anyone? Annette, Margarita, anything?
No. Thank you. Again, if you're
Okay.
interested in being a reporter, that's very valuable information. I mean, the FSA office called me a month ago. They're going to be using those prices for insurance purposes, which I warned them not to be careful with those prices, but they're going to use them anyway. So we need more reporters so that we can have more accurate information so that farmers will not get bad references when looking for insurance or any other information. So it's very valuable information, but we need more accuracy than what we have right now. So,
Margarita, is that for just a local farmers market week? Is that a weekly thing that they would look at doing? Okay.
Yes. I mean, again, the 4 reporters we have is because they do engage with farmers markets, so they can do that anyway, and it's not very time consuming. I usually give you guys an impact report at the end so that you can put that in your annual report. It has huge impact, and that's probably the biggest request we have is how much should I charge for pumpkins or sweet corn? That's a very important tool.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. There's Greg. Yes, sir.
One question, I would pose this maybe to Annette or Margarita, either one. Do we have anything that looks at this from just an overall comparison of risk on these crops? You know, if I approached Annette or Margarita, either one, and said, hey, you know, I'm thinking about growing vegetables or produce here, what would you tell me any to stay away from? Or if I was just getting started with this and I'm approaching this from the beginning farmer standpoint, Annette, you know, if you're really interested and you want to get your feet wet, start here and look at these. I'd probably stay away from these. Do we have anything like that that kind of looks at a risk, cost, reward type standpoint?
Since Dave Lockwood's not on here, I can say stay away from the fruit crops and just go for the vegetable crops. But they do tend to have more of a risk, some of the fruit crops. So as far as vegetable crops go, I think Margarita would tell you the same thing, that it depends on where you're located and what your market might be. So a good example is we have people, when they see some of those farmers market prices like garlic, they think they want to grow 2 acres of garlic and they're going to, fund their retirement. So a little garlic goes a long way. I would say it's all size and market dependent. So there's nothing I would necessarily avoid on the vegetable side from a production standpoint. It's just, how are you going to market it and how much of that crop in the market bear?
So, Greg, I'll follow up with Annette as far as expectations. There's nothing you should stay away from, but you have to be aware about, labor intensity. Again, most of these smaller guys are actually, the labor sources is not that they're going to hire labor. I have these old couple that they're doing everything by themselves. So you probably want to stay away from very labor intensive crops. On tomatoes, they're all attractive, right? Everybody knows how to grow tomatoes. It's an easy crop. It's something that they want to take to a farmer's market. It's very popular. But one of the risks you have is that every single vendor in a farmer's market is going to have tomatoes. So you're going to get stuck unless you're growing a specific variety of tomato. You're going to get stuck sitting there because you're going to be the new grower in the market that doesn't know how to differentiate your product. On the other hand, when you talk about asparagus, you don't see a lot of vendors selling asparagus. As I told you, in Rutherford and Knox County are the only markets that we report that. It's probably because only customers in those counties are looking for that special crop. And then I would say that will differentiate you and you might be able to get a good price and good profit there. Nonetheless, you saw that it's a perennial crop. So you will be preparing your soil, planting, and you're not going to see any money until year 3. So it's kind of like a fruit crop. It's not as risky as a fruit crop, but it's like something that you're not going to be making money, right? On the sweet corn part, this is one thing that I learned from my student. That's an easy, correct me if I'm wrong, Annette. Very attractive crop, fairly easy to grow, right? There's some intensity. My student, he harvests the sweet corn with his dad. So yeah, it can be labor intensive if you're harvesting the crop by hand. Nonetheless, when looking at the cost, and if you're selling it on the side of the road, or you have a truck and you sit on the farmer's market, that sweet corn grows fast. So again, on the marketing perspective, it's like an easy crop, how much I invest, how much I differentiate. Everybody wants to go to tomatoes. And yeah, because it's easy, everybody wants them, but you might get stuck with the crop. If you're a beginner grower, you're not gonna be differentiating yourself from anybody else, and might get stuck with the crop. So that's based on my experience, what I could tell you, Greg. But just to give you a more educated answer, I could find some extension publications that might help you, that you can hand out to growers so they can think about all these things about risk and opportunities with these crops we covered today. Will that help, Greg?
Thanks, Greg, for the question. Thanks for the answers on that too. And Greg's got the best looking background I've seen in a while. So I like that. Anything else from anyone?
Hey, Annette, if somebody was going to start out growing asparagus, would you recommend like they start out with 1/4 an acre, 1/2 acre, or is there a good answer for that?
Asparagus, you can get a lot of asparagus off a fairly small area. When I was putting this together, it said the majority of asparagus farms in the US are 1 acre or less. So if I was just starting out, I might go with 1/8 of an acre and see how I do, because it is fairly intensive to put out the first year that you're putting the crowns in. And again, while we don't see a lot of asparagus, I think a little asparagus could go a long way. So you have to have that market. And because you're harvesting it daily in the height of the season, it's not going to cut it unless you have the cooling capabilities as well to just harvest it once a week and take it to a farmer's market, because you're going to have too much. So I would weigh all that into, again, weigh the market in there and see what the market might be able to sell. So smaller is probably better to start out with, and then you can ramp up from there.
Annette, how labor intensive can it be, asparagus? I mean, I'm thinking from the labor intensity, you're going to be harvesting week after week. And
yeah, so you have to have the labor to be able to harvest it every other day or every day. So from that perspective, it's going to be more labor intensive, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be like a tomato harvest, right? So when you're harvesting tomatoes, it's a lot of labor. Asparagus is going to be a lighter harvest. So it might be a couple hours a day, depending on how big your asparagus patch is, but it's not going to be as labor intensive as something like summer squash or tomato from that perspective. But yeah, I'd start small, because I don't know how much asparagus a local market could bear.
Okay, thank you. What about Brussels sprouts? I mean, I know you didn't talk about that today, but how easy are they to grow in particularly West Tennessee?
A lot of people either swear by, and it's not consistent across Tennessee, and I'm not sure where West Tennessee falls into that. Some swear by spring Brussels sprouts, and other people swear by fall Brussels sprouts, and they're fairly divided. So they're fairly easy to grow. Insects are going to be a big thing with them, but some people grow them this time of year because they say that the frost actually sweetens the flavor of them. So if you have a later market that keeps going, a later farmer's market that you could move them through or something like that, I think it would work to grow them in the fall. Tend to have more insect pressure in the fall, though, just because they've been building up throughout the year.
Thanks, Kenny. Anything else from anyone? Appreciate y'all's interest in hanging around for a little bit. That's going to do it. All right. Thank you all for being on today. Again, Annette, Margarita, thank you for all the information. Thank you for the questions. Y'all have a happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for being here today.
Happy Thanksgiving.